The temptation is, of course, on an occasion like this, and let me first of all say I'm absolutely astonished and amazed and very, very grateful for the conception of the organizing committee and the fabulous amount of work that they've done, the careful planning. It is just exceptional, and I want to say it's extraordinary, and I'm very, very grateful to be here as a result of their work. And then the first point I want to make about me is that the important things that I've done with others. Always with other people. So the C in critical discourse analysis, and luckily he walked in just as we were about to start, was done with my friend Bob Hodge in the work that became critical linguistics, the book Languages, Ideology, and then Social Semiotics. And it was intense working together, teaching together, but also being friends together, and understanding lots, and a lot of work, but intense work. Across points of difference. Bob and I are not the same person, but whenever Bob said that doesn't make sense, apart from being upset, I thought, therefore I need to think really hard about what this person is after. The context in which we worked was the early 70s. The early 70s, as Norman rightly said, are not comparable in many ways to where we are now. And so it was possible, the environment was conducive, or at least allowed the kind of work which we regarded, and people like of my generation regarded as proper academic work. That is, you thought about issues and you spent a lot of time, you didn't have research funding. I worked with two other people very strongly, with Tony True, a political philosopher, and David Ayres, a literary critic. And it was that kind of environment that made it possible to kind of do things which simply weren't on the syllabus. So then the question is not a kind of a grand account from my part of it, but little bits of different kinds of bibliography, biography, and not just a kind of intellectual biography, or maybe I make no distinction between a personal and an intellectual biography. For me, the two are very closely linked. I am the father of 4 children, whatever that may mean. All came into the world very specifically. I remember at the birth of one, the midwife said, "She's a cheeky little thing." The moment this little thing appeared in the world, and I thought, how can we have a theory which preserves the notion of the specificness, the bodily difference, the physiological, the biological difference of that person, and at the same time preserve the importance of the social in which they will be formed, which will supply the resources for them to form their identity. That became a kind of a crucial question for myself in an improperly named book called Linguistic Processes in Sociocultural Practice. I attempted to kind of combine that sort of thinking with then still dominant Althusserian thinking, which said, discourse is speak us. Well, the notion of agency comes for me from that question. How can we be agent under those conditions? The second is, of course, experiences in teaching. So at East Anglia, a student came into my room and said, I wanted to ask, could I have an extension? And after, I then thought, why did this person use the past tense when he asked me right at this instance? And why did he use the hypothetical conditional kind of mode, or call it tense if you like? What is it he wanted to achieve with these particular forms? A temporal distancing and an epistemic distancing, because there is the social distance of power. In other words, distance of one kind, social distance, being expressed by semiotic forms such as past tense, temporal distance, epistemic distance. And this is a kind of a semiotic notion that the sign is always that kind of conjunction that we make at a particular moment, of course, having resources which we have given to us. And the other thing that, and this is just sort of a little picking, critical discourse analysis in its early days was subjected to a sort of constant and niggling critiques from people who shall be nameless in this gathering. Norman would know some of them. And I thought it was a kind of a naive notion of politics and academic work, which led to that kind of niggle. But we needed to have an answer for it. And for myself, the notion of the motivated sign, namely that I make a sign in which the meaning that I wish to make is expressed in the substance, like I wanted to ask, I'm distancing myself temporarily from you who are distant from me so socially so powerfully. The motivated sign for me became, and this is an outcome of actually the meeting that Toyn had inaugurated here, as a response to that I wrote this question of arbitrariness as a metaphor, or the non-arbitrary sign for critical discourse analysis. So for me the thing was, how does power shape action, or how do I shape my actions in the presence of power? And I mean by action very much what Norman said about action. Action of all kinds, human action in social environments, is always meaningful. And so for me, a kind of, if I use the term critical discourse analysis, which I won't now do, but the social semiotic is to say the world of meaning is very large. In the world of meaning we act in all kinds of ways. And all these actions are meaningful, and all of these forms of making meaning are taking place in fields of power and should be accounted for by the kind of work we do. By the late 80s, the notion of critique seemed to me to be sort of somewhat odd. Critique was to bring things into crisis. Others had actually worked quite hard to bring the world into different kinds of crises, which we are now still living with. And then that coincided for me with a move from media studies and cultural studies in Sydney to education in London. And I thought, although it's a dominant strain still in kind of educational thinking, that you give young people critical skills, critique is always backward-looking. It looks at what has happened, and it looks normally at what those more powerful than us have done to us. And I thought young people and children could use the tools that we collectively had developed in critical discourse analysis to give them the tools for design. That is, how can I put my interests and my wishes into the world? How can I shape my representations in the world so that my interests are present there? And I think we collectively had by then established a set of tools which could do that. So that for me has become a major aim, and not just confined to education, because of course education happens everywhere and all times and is a constant. So two things that I'm now interested in is, at a micro-level scale, how do young people in school make meaning? And what tools of recognition to those who make assessments and valuations, usually assessments that, in metrics which are quite alien to those who make the meanings, do we have means of recognizing what meanings are being made and giving value to them? For that, I think it's absolutely essential that we expand our conception of the world of meaning. A world of meaning which confines itself to language alone, speech or writing, and especially language conceived of in terms of basically 19th century linguistics, which are very, very kind of restricted in terms of what actually we do with, say, speech, but also with writing, is simply too limited. So I have begun to think, of course, with my friend Theo, who's here, over a long period in relation to the visual, but now also in relation to other kinds of practices with somebody who's engaged in surgery. How do we kind of encompass, begin to understand the scale and the frame of the world of meaning, and how do we apply the kinds of tools we have to making sense of that? And maybe, and I join Norman completely in that, bring about a difference in normal practices. Thank you.